hand of the master, and where you don't have that other than in the surface retouching. You learn to find also little telltale signs, such as the extreme, the edge of the maul stick, where he's leaning his right hand while he paints, and you find this in a number of Rubens paintings, especially smallish paintings, on the right-hand side, usually upper right-hand side, and people that work on Rubens here will have seen that as well. Of course, other people can use this too, but you're adding evidence that ends up forming this picture in your mind of what is different between a Rubens workshop painting and a picture where he has intervened in a picture which is entirely by his hand. And retouching becomes, in his case, something that he says that a connoisseur becomes especially sensitive to. This is a picture I just saw a few weeks ago in the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, and this is really based on a hunch, so I wouldn't want to carry this too far. But if you see this in the flesh, you'll see a kind of detailed working of this area here, and a silky look of this cloth in this area as well. They are very un-Rubens-like, at least they seem that way to me. And again, this is a hunch. Do not do connoisseurship or art history based only on a hunch. But it brings me to something I want to tell you, which is the fact that a lot of Rubens' paintings have retouching by himself. A lot of his workshop paintings have retouching by him. But a lot of Rubens' paintings were retouched later on. He was very famous, very important, very expensive, even during his own lifetime. So there was a lot of reasons to finish up, to retouch, to fix up paintings that could be sold like Rubens's. And these reasons existed throughout the centuries. So it is a problem that people working on Rubens very often encounter. And you find commissions like this one in the mid-1630s in Madrid, that he did for the king in Madrid, Torre de la Parada. When looking close, you find that calligraphy is changing a bit. He's an older artist, but you still recognize this liveliness of spirit, a category that Chinese connoisseurs already by the 10th century are singling out as one of the things that one needs to be able to identify or overlap with the work of an artist. And in Rubens, it really is very special in particular. It's tricky, though, because in this one commission, we know that Rubens hired a lot of outside workshops to do some of the paintings that he was designing, but we know that he saved at least 14 for himself. But of those 14, some are made not by himself, but by his workshop, and simply retouched by him, and you learn how to recognize a lot of this retouching in this area here, which of course could also be done by workshop assistants who were being trained to make paintings that looked like his. So as you see, the problem becomes complicated, and even more so by the fact that in this same series of the Torre de la Parada, painted around 1635 or so, includes some paintings that are painted entirely by him, and you recognize this handling of the brush, and this, what is not good or bad, but rather characteristic of his way of painting. Rubens worked in collaboration very often as well, and he collaborated with other artists, but also with his workshop, and there were spin-offs. And this here you see a famous circa 1617 picture, all by Rubens, we think, at least on the surface, and then you see how someone, very Rubensian but unlike him, is using that same body to make a different painting. Little differences, such as the hand of Christ was a little bit more closed, the right hand of Christ. Here it's a little bit more open, but the x-ray shows that the fingers were closed more than they look now. The legs bent down a little bit more, but they used to look more like these do here. The workshop is using Rubens's original to make spin-offs to make money for Rubens. In a workshop, in a case like this, some of us think that you can recognize the hand of Van Dyck. Other colleagues think that is not the case. He collaborates with other artists as well in making what are not really workshop pieces, but collaborative works, such as this picture with Snyder's. And you see the still life is all by Snyder's, the figures are all by Rubens, but you can see, especially here, and go and see this in the gallery, where you recognize retouching 2 layers of paint, and retouching in a style that's very similar to this, which is very characteristic of Rubens around this time, 1612, 13, 14, 11, so on. So again, you really, careful looking and understanding of how the artist works. It's the retouching in this area here. I don't expect you to really understand or see this in the slide, but the pictures in the galleries, and you can go and look at it there. Few more images of Rubens simply to learn about what is characteristic of him, a strong sense of form and so on. This beautiful contrasting concave and convex lines that are all gathering force, and you end up really, nobody's able to imitate this in Rubens's workshop, as far as we know, of course. This real sense of, this compressed force that makes these things so pleasurable to look at. Rubens, the new Michelangelo. You also a lot of surface activity of that type. This is also very typical of Rubens. He's a lot of variety and activity, and real shying away of flat surfaces, and real shying away of repeating patterns also. The calligraphy is full of variety, and he really is giving life to what he paints by doing these things. Beautiful head of one of the apostles that's hanging in the galleries now, but a reminder also of how conservation, restoration can make us doubt paintings and make attributions something that is less sure than it may seem like at first sight. Look at the way in which Rubens has worked directly up from the ground to the surface of the flesh, to the three-dimensional forms here. If that was cleaned a little bit too much, suddenly it would make no sense. You could almost argue in a picture of this size that has already happened. I don't know if you see what the ground underneath the hair and the ground in this area, and how that very suddenly moves to this very strong volume, a sense of three dimensions that you have in the flesh areas of the face. Again, if this would take a little bit, just a very little bit of too much cleaning, of over-cleaning, to make this simply not work, and we would maybe think that this was a workshop painting if that happened. This picture was donated to the Prado in 1930, and Prado catalogs very soon started saying by 1940 that this may have been painted by Rubens. It's a copy after a picture by Bernard van Orley, and it does certainly have a certain Rubensian taste to it. The Corpus Rubenianum volume, one of the fairly recent volumes, picked up on these early Prado catalog ideas of a certain Rubensian look to it and say that this is actually a picture by Rubens that was painted possibly when the artist is young, after that original by Van Orley. We did a dendrochronology of this, which tells us that it could not have been painted in any way before 1616, and most likely it was painted later, but in any case not before 1616. And I think it seems obvious to people who work on Rubens that if this is by Rubens, it would have to be a much earlier work. It could not really be a work by 1616. The catalog called attention to the fact, rightly so, that this is not a Royal Collection painting in Spain. It's a donation from the 1930s. And sometimes in places like the Prado, we give a lot of credit to the fact that things have a very good pedigree. A lot of pictures were made, certainly in the case of Rubens, directly for the King of Spain, or bought directly by him, or were gifts to him, and they have an old history that supports attributions. But this was a 1930s donation. In fact, it has a B on the lower left corner, and that B does imply that it does come from the Royal Collection. The B is the Palace of La Bobadilla in the outskirts of Madrid, from which a private collector bought a lot of paintings, which were then donated to the Prado. So information gathers, and sometimes we have a hard time knowing what to do with it. I think in a case like this, it's very clear that 1616 is a bit too late for this artist for Rubens to have painted that. Last slide I'm going to show you, just a few weeks ago, or about a month ago in New York, I was shown a painting that's been shown to some other to some other people in the past, and I think some colleagues were also about to look at it in New York at that time. The picture that I was showed was the picture from which the detail on the right has been taken, and it's a copy or a version or a good-looking painting that's almost identical to one of the early Van Dycks that the Prado has, the Taking of Christ, which is hanging in one of the galleries. Letters that accompany this composition by John Rupert Martin and Arthur Wheelock, say from the 1970s and from the early 21st century, talk about it possibly being a picture with a lot of workshop intervention, but a good-looking picture, which indeed it is. What we were able to see now, because we know we have taken x-rays of our painting that didn't exist in the past, is that some things that you can see here, like with the case of the Bosch that we just saw Fritz talk about, some things that we see in this figure, and especially this kind of sliced outfit that this man wears on his back, those are in the x-ray of our painting. So whoever painted this picture on the right was someone who knew a previous stage of our painting, someone who knew what was going on in Van Dyck's studio. And the picture still, when one approaches it, has a kind of a mechanical quality. It seems like a repetition. It seems to lack a little bit of this liveliness that one finds in the original. But clearly it needs to be brought at least as close to the artist as the studio. And I think I'll leave it at that, and we can continue our discussion in a few minutes. Thank you.